This week on Route 2020, a loss on the nation's highest court, now leading to a Republican rush to fill the seat. Both sides putting up a fight now just weeks before the election. The candidates now stepping up their campaigns and stepping up the attacks on each other. Surrounded by issues that could define this election.
It's just scary being a black person.
Americans have had it up to their back teeth with division.
Then the coronavirus leading to uncertainty at the polls on Election Day.
I think there's going to be fewer voters at any polling place, any way we do it.
Not just fewer voters, fewer people to run the polls.
This is actually working.
Also, one of Hollywood's biggest stars spending a lot of time in Washington.
I knew this would be a very challenging undertaking.
Captain America trying to teach America as we take you along Route 2020.
This is what democracy looks like. Our house! Our house!
Hi everyone, I'm Blair Miller. The latest polls show the presidential race tightening up, especially in some of the swing states. Here on Route 2020, we bring you the most important issues from the campaign trail. The coronavirus remains one of the defining issues of this election. Recently, we've seen the focused shift to filling a vacancy at the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's where we begin this week, at our first stop. The passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and one final salute, now leading to a race to fill her seat before the election.
It is my honor to nominate one of our nation's most brilliant and gifted legal minds to the Supreme Court.
Judge Amy Coney Barrett, President Trump's pick for Supreme Court Justice. Republicans now believe there will be a vote for her confirmation before the Judiciary Committee on October 22nd, followed by a vote on the full Senate floor right before the November election. With the open Supreme Court seat, it's refocusing voters on divisive issues like health care and abortion just before the election. As Election Day gets closer, the candidates are campaigning very differently. Recently, the president has held events in Nevada and Arizona, indoors and filled with supporters, and leaving it up to voters to take social distancing precautions. Democrat Joe Biden's approach is dramatically different, wearing a mask in public and holding smaller events. Both are largely focused on a handful of battleground states, but both campaigns are also ramping up their legal strategies in those states by deploying ballot counting watchers. They'll be ready to contest any issues that may arise on election night. Political analysts say it could become an opening for misinformation to take hold if it's a close race.
The longer it takes to count the ballots, the more of a vacuum there is for foreign adversaries and others who want to sow disinformation and reduce voter confidence to fill that void with misinformation about rigging and extensive voter fraud.
In some states, mail-in voting and early in-person voting is now underway. The president continues to blast the process.
Everyone knows mail-in ballots are a disaster.
While Biden says it's all an attempt to delegitimize the election.
If the president had even remote confidence he was likely to win the election, he wouldn't be doing this.
One issue that isn't going away is the fight for racial justice in this country, with groups like Black Lives Matter leading the charge. This week, we look at how that fight is driving voters on both sides of the aisle. It started as a movement, fueled by a desire for racial justice stemming from the deaths of men and women of color. Those protesting coming from all walks of life. Not just fighting to be heard, but fighting for real change.
Their lives have repeatedly been shown by our institutions in the United States that they don't matter, and we're here to say that they do matter and that we are going to fight until they matter just as much as everyone else in this country.
According to the A report by ACLED, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, there were close to 8,000 Black Lives Matter protests around the country over a 3-month period this summer.
It's just scary being a black person. Like, how can I not be here? How can I not be here fighting for this?
From Louisville to St. Louis and in Portland, Maine. In some cases, the tensions boiled over. But the ACLED found the vast majority, 93% of demonstrations connected to the Black Lives Matter movement were nonviolent. The report found when demonstrations did turn violent, there were, quote, infiltrators instigating the violence, in some cases with far left and far right extremist groups.
We've always had the problem of extremist groups who want to come in and bring violence into a nonviolent protest.
Both presidential candidates weighed in during the campaign.
I don't think the Democrats have the courage to control these people. They're afraid to even talk about law and order.
I want to make it absolutely clear, something very clear about all of this. Rioting is not protesting. Looting is not protesting. Setting fires is not protesting. None of this is protesting.
Some officials in cities across the country who've seen the protests on their streets say, without law and order, the message is lost.
That sort of behavior does nothing, absolutely nothing, to endear the Black Lives Matter cause.
A recent survey by Pew Research found 67% of American adults support Black Lives Matter. How that movement is viewed and how it changes could decide the presidential race. When we get to Election Day, some states say they could be scrambling to have enough people work the polls. Older people who normally volunteer for these roles are at higher risk for coronavirus, and that's prompting some of them to cancel their plans to work. Route 2020's Aaron Martin reports from Pennsylvania to show us how serious a problem this could become in many states.
Soldiers and Sailors Memorial is one of the most recognizable spots in Pittsburgh, and it also happens to be the second largest polling location in all of Allegheny County. But with the coronavirus pandemic, there's a lot of concern about what voting will look like in November, not just with people showing up to the polls, but whether there will even be enough people here to work them.
I think one of the most important things we do, and one of the only voices we have as citizens, is the voting.
Blythe Runsdorf believes in the significance of voting, which is part of the reason she's now been an elections judge for more than 2 decades. But with the coronavirus pandemic, expanded mail-in balloting, and new voting machines, she knows November 3rd will be unlike any election she's ever experienced.
I think there's going to be fewer voters at any polling place, any way we do it, because of the ability to do it by mail.
While no excuse absentee voting is expected to give more people a chance to vote, it's not easing the burden of finding people to work the polls. During the June primary, polls were consolidated statewide due to the coronavirus pandemic, with Allegheny County only operating 161 polling sites, or about 12% of a normal election. Come November, the county will be legally obligated to open more than 1,300 polling places, which will require 6,500 workers to keep them operational. Experts believe that could create a unique problem, since senior citizens typically make up the majority of poll workers.
We often get those poll workers from retirees, and those are the same people who are at the most danger of getting COVID-19 and having the most serious cases.
Chris Kantek is a political science professor at the University of Pittsburgh. She believes getting enough poll workers this year will be a challenge, especially when you consider the number of absentee ballots.
They're going to have a greater need for manpower this year than in previous years because it's a little bit more complex to count absentee ballots.
After June's primary went off without any major issues, Allegheny County leaders started preparing for November. Mailers were sent out in July to get commitments from previous poll workers, and more aggressive recruiting is already underway. Runsdorf is in charge of voting at Soldiers and Sailors in Oakland, the second largest precinct in Allegheny County. She already has 4 commitments from people to work the polls.
I need 7 in my district. That's what I'm permitted by the county to pay.
She says all of her workers will wear masks and gloves to keep everyone safe, which she's confident will happen. But with so many variables hanging over the election, Kantak believes issues are inevitable.
I do think that there's a possibility that Western Pennsylvania could be holding up the whole show. But frankly, I'd be surprised if there isn't someone holding up everything.
Now, Kantek is hopeful that more young people who aren't in high-risk categories will volunteer to work the polls, something that very well could be essential if there's going to be as seamless an election as everyone is hoping for. Reporting in Pittsburgh, I'm Aaron Martin for Route 2020.
Ahead on Route 2020, the FBI preparing for the election.
Trying to stay ahead of that threat is a constant challenge for the FBI.
We go one-on-one to find out what they're doing to keep your vote safe. And next, A superhero in Washington showing up a lot.
It's a way to have a connected, focused discussion around an issue.
Captain America focused on American politics without an agenda.
There's a gray area in how most people see the world.
When Route 2020 continues. It's not unusual for Hollywood to try and shape politics, but one actor is doing it differently. He says he's working to educate voters with no bias and no agenda. This week, I talk with actor Chris Evans about why he's spending so much time here in D.C. He's one of the more unique people to see on Capitol Hill, but also perhaps more recognizable than most here in Congress.
Chris, right here, please.
Chris Evans, known for his superhero role as Captain America.
Hey, what's going on?
But now unmasked, he's trying to help people see the good in politics. Before the pandemic, he was visiting Washington, meeting with members of Congress to get them involved in his new online project, A Starting Point.
Short answers to common questions.
The website breaks down different issues, and lawmakers from both sides of the aisle explain their perspective in videos that are less than 2 minutes long.
I think it's such a great idea.
Evans and Hollywood director Mark Kaysen have worked on films together before, but teamed up again for A Starting Point. They recently told me how they started working on this project in 2017.
I knew this would be a very challenging undertaking, and Mark was up for the task. We dove in and just started getting to work. And then, like I said, the last couple of years, Mark and I have been making these trips to DC and trying to bring this thing to life.
Why is this so important from the aspect of how you guys are coming at this?
It's an effort to try and create engagement, an effort to try and offer information to voters directly from the elected officials themselves.
Evans and Kaysen admit Washington at first was reluctant to get involved.
So out of the gate, I think they were pleasantly surprised that I wasn't there telling them how to do their job. I was there to ask their opinion and to hear their thoughts and to offer them a mechanism that can connect them to their voters. You know, I think Mark and I both agree, everybody can win here.
What do you hope is the biggest takeaway as this kind of gets out there?
Some of these answers we got from some of these elected officials really reminded me that that's okay, that you can that there's a gray area in how most people see the world. And I think that opens the door to a more civil discussion when things aren't so much, you versus me and, good versus evil.
Good versus evil. Of course, plenty of people are frustrated with politics right now. Evans is trying to change that and says he'll keep adding to the site even after the election. When it comes to the election, more Americans are expected to vote by mail this year than ever before. Route 2020's Samantha Manning breaks down what kind of role that could play in this election. It's this week's Deep Dive.
We wanted to take a closer look at how all those ballots could impact the U.S. Postal Service. USPS says it delivers more than 470 million pieces of mail every day and more than 2.5 billion pieces of mail over the holidays. Now, the U.S. Census Bureau says in 2016, about 158 million Americans were registered to vote. But even if every person voted by mail, it wouldn't be sent out at the same time. So let's say everyone voted by mail over the course of 2 weeks. That would mean there was an extra 11 million pieces of mail per day, which the Postmaster General says they are ready to handle. And if you do choose to vote by mail, make sure you get those requests in early. The Postal Service recommends that you mail in your ballots at least 15 days before Election Day to make sure your vote counts. I'm Samantha Manning for Route 2020.
Next on Route 2020, the battleground states.
There are 6 states that are really going to decide this election.
From now until Election Day, the key states to watch. Then, hundreds of thousands of lives lost to the coronavirus. So what have we learned in the 6 months since the pandemic started?
50 years from now, what do you think people will say about how we all responded?
Ahead on Route 2020. A recent report by Microsoft shows Russian, Chinese, and Iranian hackers have attempted to access people, campaigns, and organizations connected to the 2020 election. Route 2020's Kirsten Garris spoke one-on-one with the FBI about what they're doing about it.
Foreign hackers are stepping up their efforts to interfere with the 2020 presidential election. A new Microsoft report shows hackers recently made unsuccessful attacks on people associated with both President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden's campaigns. It's a threat FBI agents say they're already watching.
We know from both 2016 and 2018 that Russia has been active in targeting our system. From both the election campaigns as well as trying to influence social media and online activities.
I talked one-on-one with FBI Special Agent in Charge, Douglas Korneski. Russia is accused of hacking the DNC, and even just last year, Florida's governor announced that Russian hackers did gain access to two voter databases. What is the FBI doing this year to make sure that the election is secure?
Most recently, we had a tabletop exercise yesterday. It was the third in a series of exercises that we've been conducting in preparation for the elections. So we are prepared to respond to any cyber attacks on the day of the election as well as leading up to it.
Special Agent Korneski says some of the biggest cyber threats continue to be social media platforms.
Obviously, the techniques that the cyber actors use to infiltrate or hack systems evolve continuously. So trying to stay ahead of that threat is a constant challenge for the FBI as well as our other partners.
He says his message to voters who may be concerned is clear.
So we're doing everything we can in our power to proactively and be prepared reactively if there are any threats on election day or leading up to it.
Since the 2016 presidential election, the FBI created a new online resource called Protected Voices with information about cyber threats for voters and campaign teams. In Memphis, Kirsten Garris, Route 2020.
While security remains a big concern, we're seeing the candidates out campaigning in ways we haven't seen before. We're also getting fresh insight into how this race may be decided. I recently spent some time talking with the president of Real Clear Politics, where they're tracking all the latest polls in this election. Tom Bevan with Real Clear Politics joins me now. So Tom, let's focus on these battleground states, because I know this is something closely you guys are watching.
There are 6 states that are really going to decide this election: Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. You maybe could throw Minnesota and Georgia into the mix, but right now we're focused on those top 6, and we're just starting to get some new polling information out of these states showing that the race is really tightening post-convention period in a few of those states.
Of those battleground states, when it comes to the Electoral College and the votes up for grabs, which one carries the most weight?
Well, so if you look, Donald Trump won by 36 electoral votes in 2016. So he could lose Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and win Michigan and still win if he holds all those other states. But if you look at that map, Florida's the key. It's 29 electoral votes. So if he loses Florida, he literally cannot lose another state or he'll lose the election. So if he can lock down Florida and North Carolina, then you're looking at those other 4 states that I mentioned. He can lose 2 of those 4 and still end up with a very, very narrow victory.
Do you think that will remain consistent up until Election Day, or could that change somewhat as far as who's considered a battleground state and who isn't?
Pretty sure those are going to be the 6 I mentioned. Look, Georgia is tighter than it has been historically. And for Republicans, and that's a state that Democrats really are looking to put into play. And then on the other side, you've got Minnesota, which is a state that was not really contested in 2016. Donald Trump lost that state only by 1.5 points, and we've seen some movement in his direction there. So both campaigns are sort of focused on that state as well. So beyond that, all the rest of the states, I think were decided in 2016 by 5 points or more, and so it doesn't look like they're going to come into play this time around.
Well, it's an interesting time for people who live in those states, certainly. Tom Bevan with Real Clear Politics. Tom, as always, appreciate your time.
Thanks, Blair.
When we come back, the realities of the coronavirus and how it's finding its place in American history.
People will look back and say, you know what, they ran into something that they weren't expecting.
The lives lost, the lives changed, and the politics of it all. 6 months after the pandemic started. Next on Route 2020. Join the conversation with us online, where you'll find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Just look for Route 2020. It's sometimes a little hard to imagine what our world will look like post-pandemic. It's been nearly 7 months since the pandemic started, and so much of our daily routines, our work and school, our elections have changed. But how will history look back on this time? We took that question to lawmakers here in Washington.
I would just say that, maybe a half a century from now, people will look back and say, you know what, they ran into something that they weren't expecting.
We are 5% of the world's people, yet we lost more than a quarter of the world's population died here. There are reasons for that, and the reason is not that our doctors are inferior, that our medical research is inferior. It's that we've underfunded public health.
50 years from now, when history is looking back at us, what will we say?
I don't think anybody really knows yet. Look, I think there are some emerging evidence that there may have been some overreactions in some cases. Some of it was because we just didn't know the nature of the virus. On the other hand, I think we could really focus on those that are most vulnerable and those that are most at risk, are elderly and those with underlying conditions.
There was no plan that was really put into place to deal with something of this magnitude. And for a country that I do believe is the greatest country in the world, we should have been leading the way.
You never, ever can take anything for granted.
Right now, still so many people trying to figure out how to handle each day. People working from home, others who've lost jobs, unable to find work, and kids learning from computers. Many of us keep asking when life will return to normal, and now some are wondering if it ever will in a world that may be forever changed. This upcoming election has been complicated by the virus, but also deep issues like race and what happens here at the U.S. Supreme Court. But it's fueling people to vote, an American passion. But it's not clear what kind of impact it will have on Election Day, which is now just weeks away. I'm Blair Miller. Thanks for watching Route 2020.
This is what democracy looks like.